Welcome to the LDA Podcast, a podcast created by the Learning Disabilities Association of America. This series is dedicated to improving the lives and education of all learners. Today, LDA's Education Committee Chair, Christina Scott Quinlan, sits down with 78-year-old Ann Johnson, who provides anecdotes and advice based on her lifelong experience with a learning disability.
Hello everyone, I'm here with Ann Johnson, a 78-year-old insider who has self-identified as having a learning disability. She's going to be talking about her learning disability throughout her lifespan and what she's learned along the way. Thank you for joining us, Ann.
Oh, you're welcome.
So when you were first diagnosed, when were you first diagnosed with a learning disability?
I was not diagnosed with a learning disability. I entered the school system before learning disabilities were known, and how I came to know about learning disabilities was actually testing students who had learning disabilities.
Oh wow, so it wasn't until you were actually in your career.
Role, right, yes.
So how did that come about?
I worked at a place called the Learning Development Clinic, and it was set up to test children with learning disabilities. And through testing them, I actually learned what a learning disability was.
Wow. So you had noted that you went to school when you were not diagnosed with a learning disability, and it wasn't until you started your career that there was some knowledge of, okay, maybe I have a learning disability. So where have you've gotten 78 years of life experience as well. So how have you seen society's viewpoints change to those with learning disabilities?
Well, initially there was like no such thing, there was no learning disability. You were just a behavior problem, or you were lazy, or issue like that. Then it kind of went through the phases of people learning that there was something to be diagnosed. And now it's almost like everybody wants to have one because you get accommodations in school and things like that. So there's the big to-do about people buying themselves into accommodations.
With the whole testing scandal situation you're referring to, yes. So in 1962, learning disability term became known, and back then you think it was kind of like shunned or not something that people were readily knowledgeable about?
Yes, I think the understanding of it has grown immensely. I think the first real notion I had was I went to a conference at Curry College in Massachusetts, and a woman named Gertrude Webb was the first person who articulated what in my mind I was beginning to think, that there are visual learners and there are auditory learners and there are experiential learners. And she was the first person who kind of took test data and actually hooked that up to the experience of learners and kind of developed ways at the college level for students to begin to cope with what they needed to cope with.
So once you found out you had a learning disability, did you have some aha moments of your earlier years, or?
Yeah, it made sense to me. Math was a particularly challenging area for me.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you went to my presentation, you'd know that I cheated through like Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and geometry, and statistics was always a problem throughout my academic career, but I had to have it in order to get to be a psychologist.
Yeah.
So, I actually forget the question.
And then, so your aha moments that looking back, once you finally had a diagnosis, you noted this aha moment of math always being a difficulty for you. Were there other aha moments, like once you had the diagnosis?
I never had a diagnosis.
Okay.
But I always do things like, the BDP thing, making B's for B's.
The transposing of letters from B to D and D to P and P to Q. Yep.
Yep. And I didn't really read until I was a senior in high school. There was a teacher that intervened in my senior year and really changed my life. I was a senior in high school. I couldn't do long division. And my school prided itself on doing well on the math sections of the college entrance exams. And I was in the college curriculum, that's another story. But they made us take these little courses called Review and Refresher Math. So we would be primed to go into these tests and do well. And about 2 weeks into the class, the teacher tapped me on the shoulder and said, I think you ought to come up to my room after school. And I did, and that was when I learned that as a senior in high school, I couldn't do long division.
Wow.
And so he worked with me. He gave me some problems and sent me to the back of the room. And when he came back to look at them, they were all wrong. And that happened day after day for a couple of weeks. And finally, he asked if I had a slide rule at home. See, this was before calculators. And I came with the slide rule, and he showed me how to use it, and I went, wow, I had learned it easily. And at that point, he said, you can't be as stupid as your grades reflect. And we talked about college, and I didn't have the kind of grades that would get someone into college. And I applied to West Virginia Wesleyan College. And that teacher wrote a letter to the dean that said, ignore her grades and let her in.
And they did?
Yeah, and that's how I got to college. It's the kind of serendipitous circumstances that kind of led me through my education experience.
Did any of those serendipitous experiences lead you into the field that you chose, psychology?
Yes. When I went to West Virginia Wesleyan, I had a dual major, and psychology was one of them. And I picked that because I thought that would have the best chances of having a future that I might want. After my master's program, I applied to a doctoral program, and man, 20 years later, I read the letter and I would not have accepted me. The writing was terrible and it was gross immaturity. So then I went out into the world of work, and that's where kids started teaching me about their learning disabilities. And then, 20 years later, I tried again. And then I got into Antioch University in New England and progressed to my doctoral degree. So it's a wild story.
So what were the kids teaching you?
Well, I learned to listen to what are verbal portmanteaus. So a portmanteau is a suitcase, with two compartments. So a verbal portmanteau would be like brunch or spork. In Maine, we have snert. We have snow that gets covered with dirt. Okay. So it's like melding concepts and words together. So this one kid, I was testing him, and I was doing the interview, and I asked him what he liked about science. And he went, experimenting. So there was the portmanteau, so he was telling me what excited him about science in this way. And then another child was trying to draw a diamond of the Bender test. And he drew the upward stroke of the diamond, and he was trying to pull his arm down, and I could see the muscles in his arm tensing, and the pencil just started drifting up. And he looked at me and he said, hey, somebody's putting a trick in me on. So there you have both, in the verbal and in the visual graphic. He's explaining to me what his problem is. So I listened, that was kind of how I learned. And finally I went, I do that stuff too. This is me.
Yeah.
The BDP thing. Oh yeah, that I do that. So I began to develop an appreciation for what was happening with me.
Mm-hmm. And as you saw it in others, it's kind of how it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
oh, wow.
when you saw it in yourself, like before you saw it in others, did you just think it was the normal thing?
I just thought I was a person who made a lot of mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
You know? I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't attending well enough to do just careless mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not careless mistakes. They're brain tricks. They're tricky-me-ons that the kid was telling me about. Yeah. And tricky-me-ons are things, like sequencing, orientation.
Yeah.
So that's how I learned.
Yeah. So you've learned about some of the things that you have that would classify you as having a learning disability.
Right.
What has been some of the biggest challenges you faced?
I think organizing the world so that I can function within it. There were my second attempt at graduate school was another fortuitous circumstance because it was like many years between the end of my master's program and the beginning of my doctoral program. So all kinds of things had happened in psychology. And when I had to take the GRE, in that 3 hours, all I got to do was read the test. But the cool thing about Antioch was at that time they were doing research where they didn't look at your GRE scores until after you graduated. So it was not a factor in my entering into school. Filling out the form to take the test took me longer than the test itself, the 3 hours of the test. So filling out forms is another thing. It's a real problem for me.
So some of the challenges you've had with the learning disability. So it was great that Antioch was using it as more of a research indicator of their students' progress or student success on the GRE scores than it was a barrier to entrance.
Right, and it was an interview also, and this was the first time I kind of struggled with trying to tell somebody that I had a learning disability because I had no documentation. Mm-hmm. But in the interview, I kind of described my learning history and my learning needs, and the fellow that was interviewing me said, well, I don't know if you can do this, but I'm going to give you the chance. So again, my foot's in the door in kind of an atypical way. So
at that point, it was up to you to make your way. So what have been some of the biggest triumphs then?
The biggest triumph, I think, was getting the degree and getting licensed. That was another challenge. Test taking was always a problem. Obviously, I didn't even really take the GRE. And another fortuitous circumstance, I got to take the last paper and pencil version of the licensing exam. So I didn't have to fight with technology, which is also another major hoo-ha for me.
So in your line of work, you test students regularly. So when they come to you, do you disclose your own struggles or to help them kind of understand themselves?
If that's helpful to them. Because lots of times I need them to help me because of my needs. My short-term memory is not good, so I tape recorded all the interviews and all the testings. So I have to say, why do I want you to let me tape record everything that you say to me? So that's because I can't remember what you say, and my handwriting is so bad that once I write it down, I can't even remember what I can't decipher what I put down there.
So you need the time to type it later, and yeah. So some of our listeners are parents or teachers that work with students with learning disabilities. If you could share a piece of advice to a parent or an individual themselves that has a learning disability, what would your piece of advice be from your years of experience?
I would say that at any age, you cannot get the help that you need unless you know what help you need. So having a good evaluation, having it explained to you in depth and understanding how it relates to your needs is the critical issue. Because otherwise, you won't get the help that you need.
And sometimes I know testing language can be quite technical, so having parents actually go that extra step of having somebody explain what the testing language actually means to them is super important.
Actually, at this point in my life, what I'm thinking about doing is creating a blog to help parents and individuals with learning disabilities understand what they need to get from the test data. Because I think often the testing is just seen as a gatekeeping thing. You know, can I get through the door and get the accommodations that are available? But true success for a learning disabled individual, I think, means that you really have to understand what's going on in your brain. You have to understand those tricky neurons, and that they are tricky neurons. And for instance, if you do the BDP thing, I would probably do it if I do it when I'm writing, I do it when I'm typing, I would probably do it when I was skywriting, if I did, you know. But you need to know that you have to monitor those things. If you want things to be the way you want them, then you have to monitor and notice the mistake, you have to correct the mistake, and then you have to get back to what you were doing. And all that takes time and energy. And I think for parents, the important thing is to be patient with your children, and to allow kind of the personal ecology that the person needs. Like, some people just need to be in an enclosed box in order to study, no distractions whatsoever. Other people need to have a little music going in the background, you know, so there's no one prescription of, if you have a learning disability, you need to be in the box with no noise.
Just really knowing your child and what their needs are and listening to what their needs are.
Right.
And empowering them in some way, whether it's empowering them through understanding the testing data and advocating for themselves, or empowering them to actually understand how the learning disability is impacting them.
Right. And it doesn't impact just academic functioning. You know, it pervades life.
Yeah.
So when you're asking the kid to go and do something and you give 3 commands and the kid can only recall 1 or 2, you know, not to get bent out of shape with the kid, because their memory just can't support that. And I think for teachers, the important thing is to keep up a conversation with the child, or with the individual. Because needs change too, you know. I had a supervisor once who wanted to be really helpful, but she was just too helpful, you know. Every time I went in and she was helping me, I felt like an idiot. Until we really had a conversation about, this is what I need from you. This is the kind of help that I need. Then things went smoothly, you know. She felt good about helping me, and I felt good about getting the help I needed.
So how can an individual, you really talk about self-advocacy there, how can they start that self-advocacy if they're young, or even those that are older? Really, what are the steps for self-advocacy that can open more doors for them? Because it sounds like you've had lots of doors open for you, so.
I think it's a problem because lots of times, you know, the child is not invited to the IEP. And I don't know why the child shouldn't participate in their own educational process. The very best thing, I think, is to really have a person sit down and explain in the child's own language, or the adult's language, what it is that they need. When I was working at K-State, I developed this system called the mountain map. So I would show the person that, you know, these are your strengths and these are your weaknesses. And out of this, we would develop a story that they could tell to their professors and to themselves, or to tutors or anyone else that needed to understand them. I have one kid that carried his around in his pocket all the time. He just whip it out. Here's what you need to know about me, that I can do this and I can't do that. And I have this kind of accommodation that will work for me. So it's all self-knowledge, I think. And hopefully the world that you're interfacing with will keep up with that, will honor it, will understand it, and be able to meet those needs. We're so, we're so afraid of somebody getting ahead for no good reason that we hold really tight to the things that might be supportive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's certainly a truth that if you have a classroom that will work for students with learning disabilities, it will work for every student.
That's a great final thought, yeah. I think that goes, that's what parents want to hear. That's what classroom teachers really should be striving for. And I think that's what all of our students want in their classrooms, to be heard and to feel like they can access the learning and progress in the learning.
Yeah, and not feel bad about it, that I'm different. You know? Yeah. We're all different.
Mm-hmm. And celebrate that.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
The whole neurodiversity movement needs to kind of embrace our differences in all areas. Yeah.
I think schools originally were developed in kind of a standardized way, you know, and it's kind of, everyone gets an equal whatever, but equity and equality are not necessarily the same,
Oh, yes, you're very right with there. Equity and equality are not the same. So I know you're a very busy woman, Anne, so I thank you for your time here, and I appreciate you giving us your time and look forward to having another conversation with you in the future.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on these issues.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for listening. In our next episode of the LDA podcast, we talk with Dr. Cynthia Stadel about the school-to-prison pipeline. This podcast is made possible by the Learning Disabilities Foundation of America. The music in today's episode includes Little Idea and Make Your Dreams a Reality by Scott Holmes, Modem by Kai Engel, Sour Grapes, England, and Bumbling by Pictures of the Floating World, and Fits and Poise by Poddington Bear. For more resources from LDA, visit ldaamerica.org.